people kind of think that, if you call out white supremacy or systemic racism, that, people must be burning crosses and saying the N-word and going to meetings, with the hood. And it's like, no, it comes in many different forms, and it often comes from very well-mannered people, well-meaning people that just subconsciously have, like we keep talking about, this implicit bias, and kind of bring that to the forefront of what they were taught and what they pass on.
Welcome to Among Neighbors, a joint project between the Point Park Center for Media Innovation and YWCA Greater Pittsburgh.
Welcome to Among Neighbors, a podcast about race, power, and privilege. I'm Andy Conti, director of the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University in downtown Pittsburgh.
Hey, Andy, long time no see. This is Barbara Johnson. I am the director of race and gender equity at YWCA Greater Pittsburgh. And normally Andy and I are sitting in the studio together, but these are COVID times, so.
They are. It's strange times. It's been a while since we've been together, and not only COVID, but we've seen the whole discussion around race really change over the last few months with obviously the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis that changed the country in a way that was different than other examples of police brutality that we've seen before that and since then. It just seemed to affect people differently, and then it brought attention to the deaths of so many other people. Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, Breonna Taylor, so many other people that have suffered at the hands of police brutality, black people. And then, of course, that led to protests around the world, not just in the United States and not just here in Pittsburgh, even though we did see it here in Pittsburgh. That really changed the discussion. And then it led to a whole different understanding of race. I mean, we now see Confederate flags are banned at NASCAR events, which just seems inconceivable. Mm-hmm. Confederate flags and NASCAR seem to go hand in hand, at some points in the past. And then, we see the Washington football team. I almost said their name, their old name, but changing their name. And Civil War statues coming down around the country. We see the Black Lives Matter words written on the street near the White House, in big letters. I'm just wondering, Barbara, from your perspective, how are you taking all this in? How is it affecting you?
It's interesting because the work that I do at YWCA includes some racial justice educational workshops. And so prior to coming to the YWCA, I had been in the diversity and inclusion field, but now I've been able to really zero in on race. And so it always never surprised me that our country is where we are today, because there are so many remnants of slavery. And the more that I do the work that I do in terms of education, I'm learning more myself, because in my opinion, our educational systems never really taught any of us about the reality of race in America. And so oftentimes I get into this very, I'll call it a dark place where, it's hard to think about the fact that this country really did intentionally oppress Black and brown people from slavery till today. Like, there's no difference. It just looks different. So yeah, some people are successful. Yeah, some people have jobs. Yeah, some people are ahead, but we could be so much better because we have the potential in this country to make sure that everybody has a good job, can get generational wealth. But unfortunately, our historic narrative has created a path that I don't know how we're going to get out of it.
Yeah, and I think for me, from a white perspective, that's what's been shocking and different about, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, was that it seems like white people are maybe taking it more seriously. They're paying attention to it differently. I live in Mount Lebanon, which is almost all white. And, we went to a rally in Upper St. Clair. There were like 500 people there, 90% white crowd, people rallying for Black Lives Matter. And then a similar thing happened in Mount Lebanon a few weeks later. And I think from the Black people that are in my circle that I've talked to and people that I know, that there's skepticism and a cynicism about whether that is actually going to lead to real change or not. But from a white perspective, it at least seems different this time, that white people are waking up to the injustices you talked about, not just the acute injustices that we see, but the chronic ones that exist, the things that you were just talking about. What is your sense on that? Do you feel like it is a different vibe this time than before?
Yeah, and I would say just exactly what you said. The fact that large numbers of white people feel compelled to, go out into the public spaces and, show that they're allies in the work. I think that that's definitely important in where we go from here. And I also think there has to be people have to see how individually they can take action in addition to the group type of public scene, because everybody does have the potential to do something or say something in their own sphere of influence in a way that can really make change. And so, if those 500 people in Mount Lebanon use their sphere of influence in a positive way to make an impact that they never thought that they really had, that can start to really bubble up the change that we need for sure. And, as a racial justice trainer, allies are so important. We can't do the work alone. We shouldn't do the work alone as brown and black people. Allies are important, and it's important to really understand the depth of the story and the depth of the person's narrative, and to be an ally in the space that those people want you to be an ally, and to step out of the way when you need to step out of the way. So I would say, yes, I'm super excited to hear that happened in Mount Lebanon, and if you know Pittsburgh, you know how segregated our neighborhoods are and polarized our neighborhoods are, both racially and economically. And so, to be standing here in Penn Hills and knowing that in Mount Lebanon there was energy around that makes me feel good.
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, I think it's interesting what you brought up about, asking brown people and black people to solve the problem of racism, because it's, that's really the way we've treated it in the United States. Like, this is a problem that black people need to solve on their own. And really, racism, it seems like, is a white problem, right? I mean, it's the way white people treat black people and brown people that is the problem. It's not brown people or black people saying, creating racism. And so finally, for the white community to finally wake up to it and say, like, oh, we need to take on this issue. We need to understand it. We need to feel comfortable even talking about it, which is where you and I have started out with this whole show, is like, we need to have more conversations about it. Seems like progress, and hopefully we can keep it going. What are your thoughts on that, Barbara?
No, absolutely. That is one of the things that's very, very important, is the communication piece. People have to be able to talk about the issues, and not only accept that there might be things that they feel uncomfortable about. And again, it's so important to realize that we didn't learn a lot of what the missing gaps of what's happening today in our society, like what created all of that. We didn't learn in school, grade school, high school, colleges. There's so many gaps in our educational system intentionally kept from us. And so, when I sit and talk with you and I talk about something that I read in, like, The Color of Law, there's some shocking things. You're like, why didn't I learn that in geography class or, history class or math class? And so we all have to be intentional about both the learning and the being an ally. And so, talking is one way to get there. And we have to be willing to, feel not hurt. Yeah, maybe hurt. We have to feel uncomfortable. We have to feel all of the range of feelings that come from these conversations, but we can never say, because I feel this way, I'm giving up, right? We have to stick in there and stay on the path. Yeah.
It's not acceptable to just say, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to walk away from it. So,
right.
And with that, I don't know if I've said this to you, but thank you for, hosting this podcast with me, because I appreciate that you trust me enough that you welcomed me into this conversation. So thanks for that, Barbara.
Absolutely.
So with all that in mind, let's bring in today's guest as well. One thing that's happened with the Black Lives Matter rallies that we've seen across the country is that reporters have gotten caught in the crossfire sometimes, literally in the crossfire sometimes, but then also figuratively. Of course, there was that famous scene in Minneapolis after the George Floyd death when the CNN reporter was arrested on air, and that's something we all watched. But here in Pittsburgh, a different situation really played out with a Post Gazette reporter who put out a tweet that I thought the tweet was funny. Barbara, what did you think? Was it a funny tweet, or how would you interpret
like I was, I was looking at it, and I saw the picture of all this garbage and a picture of this, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is a rally in Pittsburgh? And then, when I read it and it said Kenny Chesney, I started laughing, because if you're in Pittsburgh, if you live in Pittsburgh, you know exactly what that looks like. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. So I thought it was funny too.
Yeah, no, it totally resonated with me the same way. And I think it resonated with lots of people because it was honest, and it just was a funny and witty way of looking at the situation. And of course, tens of thousands of people have retweeted it. And then the response from the newspaper was that the Post Gazette said that reporter, Alexis Johnson, was no longer allowed to cover any of the Black Lives Matter rallies. And then it got a little absurd because her colleagues at the newspaper, almost every member of the newspaper guild who has a Twitter account, retweeted it. And one of them, and the most famous, was probably Michael Santiago, a photographer who he then was prevented from covering Black Lives Matter, and then everyone who had retweeted it was also prevented from it. And so you had the situation where the Post Gazette, one of the region's leading news sources, has a room full of reporters and photographers, and then the editors and managers decided they couldn't send any of them out because they'd all sent out the same tweet. So we're joined today by Alexis Johnson. Alexis, welcome.
Thanks, guys. I mean, geez, when you put it like that.
Well, what do you think? Yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting because I've been living it, so every time I see it or read about it, it just kind of gets more and more bizarre to me. It's like I have a little bit of a, not imposter syndrome, but, kind of just, it's still unreal kind of that, you're talking about me, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like I see my name and I hear my name, but it's also, it's honestly just been a lot to process and register that all those things have transpired. So thank you for that. Was a good recap.
Oh, thank you. So we're not going to
very accurate.
We're not going to get into the specifics of the tweet or what happened with the Post Gazette because that's really been talked about a lot, and of course you have a pending lawsuit against the newspaper as well. But we're really interested in your perspective and how it's changed you and just your perspective as a person. So how has it changed you, that experience of going through that as a journalist and as a person, as a Black person? What are some of your takeaways from just having gone through that whole experience of having, national attention and everything around one tweet?
It's been a lot, I just kind of never expected to kind of be in that position. Up until that point, I really hadn't had any personal gripes with management or felt personally targeted or attacked or discriminated against in any way. Not to say that there was never any microaggressions that, we feel as Black people in America or in any corporate setting, every single day that we kind of just let roll off our shoulders because, it is what it is. I mean, the Black percentage of reporters in the Post Gazette, I think, is less than 10%. And there's no Black people in news management. We have one in sports, and we have a Black nighttime copy editor who oversees, the nighttime management of what goes on the paper. But as far as news, business, arts and entertainment, city cops, anything like that, there's kind of no Black people making these decisions. So, that just kind of creates this general, kind of feeling of otherness and that kind of thing. But, I felt that my entire life, like Barbara said, I've grown up in Pittsburgh where it's been very segregated. I'm from Penn Hills. Back in the day when I was going to Penn Hills, I was the only Black girl in several of my classes. Now it looks a lot different. But, so to kind of be thrust into this situation, it's kind of like, you never thought that this would happen to me kind of situation, and then it does. And but honestly, Andrew, when it first happened, when I got the call that I was no longer being allowed to cover these protests, the first thing I did was call my mom because I was so pissed off. I was like pacing back and forth. I was like on my porch screaming. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they're taking me off this for this tweet. So I've kind of just, after it kind of blew up, and you go through these feelings of like, is because, we didn't ask for it to blow up like this. It wasn't like we were like leaking this to national, media outlets. We filed our grievance, and the grievance was leaked to a local outlet. I think Pittsburgh City paper was the first to break it. And then it was kind of game on from there. And I was getting all kinds of questions from reporters from Washington Post and New York Post. I ended up on Julian Reed show. So, that it was like, whoa, and you kind of stop and you're like, is this that big a deal? Like, you're like, whoa, like I didn't, we didn't want it to, not want necessarily is the right verb for it, but, kind of just didn't expect it to grow the legs that it did. But that I kept thinking back to, those initial feelings that I had that, something was wrong here. I was being, discriminated against or treated unfairly in some way. Those initial feelings of anger that I had when I got the call. And then to see how much everybody kind of supported me and backed me and was interested in the story, kind of really validated what I was feeling. So that was really great because, like I said, we feel these microaggressions and we might speak out, we might not, because we don't know how many people will back us or, think that we're crazy or, whatever the case may be. So it's kind of just been really affirming that, like, you guys were having the conversation about allies, that so many allies, being a 90% white newsroom, still came to back me in that way and made it, what it is today. And I'm here speaking with you guys. So it's been just kind of a whirlwind of emotions, honestly.
I'm curious. I mean, you talked about the allies, but I think about, my own experiences in newsrooms and, as a white journalist in a newsroom, it's easy to not think about race, right? You're just a journalist in a newsroom. But do you feel like how much does it color your experience of being in the newsroom, being Black? Do you feel like that all the time? Is it something that you think about, hey, I'm not being heard by my bosses because I'm Black, or I don't feel like there's a path toward success in that because of my color?
Yeah. I mean, how can you kind of feel hopeful about a path toward success when none of your managers are Black? You know what I mean? It's like, you have to you can't be what you don't see, and you have to kind of, know what's possible and see these people be like, okay, they've made it, so kind of I can too. And like you said, being a white reporter, you kind of almost never feel that otherness or anything like that because that's just the way of the land, you know what I mean? And that kind of takes me back to, I guess one good instance would be when I did the Black restaurants list in February. And I've spoken about this before, but, when I pitched it, it was kind of the end of Black History Month. And you don't want to be there's always this thing. It's like, do the Black reporters have to pitch the Black stories, for Black History Month? And, this whole month, am I going to be the one to have to cover? So I'm kind of waiting around to see what the general plan was for Black History Month. What our white editors were going to come up with, if anything at all, for Black History Month. Are we going to do anything special? Are we going to do anything to up our coverage and recognize, this historical month? And it was kind of getting towards the end, and I was like, I'm just going to pitch this Black restaurants list because, like I said, growing up in Pittsburgh, I eat at these places all the time. And, we have a food writer, Dan Giggler. He's actually visited some of them, but, when it comes to lists and best pizza, and, Pittsburgh was ranked best place for food in the world or something. It's from some article, I had put it in my thing. So I was like, yeah, but, are these Black restaurants included in these conversations when we're talking about Pittsburgh's food landscape that we're so famous for? So I pitched it to one person, and once I started working on it because they approved, and kind of once it got to the higher ups, there was kind of this like, whoa, we need to talk about this. Like, is this pandering? Like, should we be doing this during Black History Month? Does it make it seem like we're only doing this because of Black History Month? And there was like an entire meeting. I mean, there was like a half-hour meeting where I kind of had to prove that it was worth doing, that it was not good. Then there was conversations like, well, is this just going to be a list? Is this just lazy pander? And I was like, no, I've done the research on that. Like, I was always almost like a third done with it by the time everybody was like, wait, like, hold on a second. And, I was getting pictures from these people. I was getting, background. I gave like 3 or 4 sentences about these owners, put a face to a name and their stories and how they had the kind of the resilience and the wherewithal to open a restaurant, things like that. We put it up and it ends up going viral. It does really well. It came back up again after all the protests and stuff started happening because everybody had this interest in supporting Black businesses. So I guess that's kind of one example of where it kind of is a fight to get Black stories done, because if you figure if I would have just pitched the best food list, my favorite food list, and it just ended up being all white-owned restaurants, that's just a list. You know what I mean? But when you have to pitch it and say it's a Black-owned list, then it's like, oh, well, let's kind of have a conversation about why. And it's like, no, we're people too. Like, we can just have a list. So that's that would be just one example, I guess, of, like I said, kind of feeling that otherness and kind of the barrier on your shoulders as a Black reporter in these newsrooms. where to take the coverage of these Black communities, and should that be our sole responsibility?
And I want to be clear about one thing before I hand it over to Barbara, is that you work at the Post Gazette, obviously, but this is not a Post Gazette problem. This is a problem
Absolutely
that exists across the news media. A few months ago, we had on Latrell Crittenden, the researcher and professor from Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, who talked about his research showing that this kind of thing is happening at news outlets all across the Pittsburgh region. And then we know from other research it's happening all across the United States. This is just a major problem that happens everywhere. So it's great to hear you sharing your perspective on it and how it played out for you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I thought about with your question, Andy, and I don't know if you feel this way too, Alexis, but I think about when I wake up in the morning and, I get dressed and I'm getting ready to go out into the world. I don't say to myself, oh my gosh, I'm Black, I'm brown. What am I going to do today? Like, I just feel human and I feel ready to take on whatever it is I'm going to take on. And it's not until you get into a situation where you are in a space where you're the only one, and then it hits you. Oh yeah, here we go with the microaggressions and the racism and the on and on and on. So it's not like you don't feel it immediately when you wake up. It becomes part of the conditioning that you walk into every day when you're in spaces where most of the people in those spaces don't look like you, don't understand you, don't care about you, don't care about, why you're here or what you have to contribute. And so I think that that's an important piece in the, that whole looking at race in America and understanding that we don't wake up that way. So I don't know if you feel like you said that there's not that many people in your job that look like you either. And so I would imagine, can you talk about how that feels for you? When you're excited about a pitched piece, there's all these white faces at you like.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, this whole situation with the tweet would have played out totally different if there was maybe just one Black manager to say, hey, let's think about this. Let's think about how we're approaching this. I was never asked to take it down. I was never given a warning, that kind of thing, or maybe looked at it from a different lens as far as, accusing me of any type of bias and things like that. I mean, we all have implicit bias. If you're telling me that a newsroom with 90% white reporters has no bias in the way we cover anything from a white lens, I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous. It may not be malicious. It may not be intentional that, we're missing certain nuances and parts when we're covering stories about race for people of color, but that's just the way it is, because you have your experience and how you grew up, like you said, and who you empathize with and who you can relate to. And I have mine. And that's why it's so important to have diversity in these newsrooms, so that we can kind of bring those all together and have a discussion before anything even hits the page. So that kind of element is missing when you're in a newsroom with, 90% white people that see these stories from a white gaze, and that's just how it is, and nobody thinks that a white reporter can be biased when they're covering white stories, because that's just a story and that's just the world. But as soon as we talk about, putting a stamp on it, and this is a Black reporter and I'm doing something for Black History Month and I'm talking about Black people, then it's kind of like, okay, well, where's your mind at? Are you biased? Are you leaning towards them? And it's like, oh, I think we can use a little Black bias in here. I think we can sprinkle a little of that. I mean, what's wrong with me leaning a little bit towards that? Because I mean, how often are we kind of on the other side of that spectrum when we're in our coverage? So I mean, like you said, that's just absolutely something we feel every day, just as Black people, and especially in these kind of corporate environment.
Right. And if our history wasn't so oppressive for hundreds and hundreds of years, then you could talk about Black bias, but for hundreds and hundreds of years, there has been oppression to the opposite side. So, let us get up.
Yeah. I mean, there's been so much conversation. I mean, like I said, I was upset that I couldn't cover the protests because, these are my friends, my family members, my people out there protesting in the streets. I mean, who better to send but me, right? I would be the expert. My dad's a retired state trooper. My mom also worked in law enforcement. She was a probation officer. So I thought I could bring all these different things, and I pitched a bunch of stories that were eventually turned down. But what I was saying was, kind of lost my train of thought there. But what I was saying was, but who better to bring that perspective than someone like me, and then to have that kind of opportunity taken away was a shame.
Barbara, I wanted to thank you, Barbara, for your explanation of how you wake up and you don't feel different. It's only when you get in a situation where you're feeling that bias. Because I think for white people, you can go through your life and not ever feel that situation where you're in an uncomfortable position where you're the only person who's different in a room. You have to really seek it out as a white person. And I think about my own experience. I went to Pittsburgh Black Media Federation meeting just before the COVID hit. And I was the only white person in the room, which was fine as what I expected, right? I put myself in that situation. But at the end, then my friend Olga George, who's a producer at KDKA, she's the vice president of the group. She turns to me and she's like, Andy, why are you here? And, what's this about? And how does it feel to be here, to be the only white person in the room? And then, she just reinforced, like, that's how we feel all the time when we're the only black person in a room you walk in. So, thanks for sharing that. And I think for white people, it's important to think about that, the fact that you never have to deal with that kind of discomfort or you can go through and not feel uncomfortable and deliberately try to put yourself in situations where you feel that so you can at least empathize with having had that experience. Is that wrong?
I think that's what we're missing a lot is the empathy. Okay. You know what I mean? It's like, I think that's kind of at the crux of all conversations about race, because like I said, there may be people that are well-intentioned that are still holding up these values of white supremacy. You know what I mean? It's like people kind of think that, if you call out white supremacy or systemic racism, that, people must be burning crosses and saying the N-word and going to meetings, with the hood. And it's like, no, it comes in many different forms, and it often comes from very well-mannered people, well-meaning people that just subconsciously have, like we keep talking about, this implicit bias, and kind of bring that to the forefront of what they were taught and what they pass on and things like that. So I think that's really important, because that is where the lack of empathy comes for somebody that doesn't look like you and somebody that may not experience things that you've experienced. I think that's where, people couldn't relate to whatever I was going through, the situation that another black person in the room may be going through, because it's kind of the lack of empathy, just because you don't understand what it is. So knowledge, like you said, having these conversations is very important to kind of push that agenda a little bit. I think, the 500 people in Mount Lebanon, they empathize with, they may not ever have an encounter with a police officer, let alone something as drastic as what happened to George Floyd, but they were able to empathize and say that, something needs to be done about this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just thinking about how you talked about the word, well, you didn't use the word subtle, but it's the subtle behaviors, the subtle actions, and it's also the subtlety in language. I was reading something and it was talking about how there's a lot of language that's coded that we don't even pay attention to. So oftentimes when people are referring to Black and brown families, they'll say inner city families, right? Mm. Then when gentrification happens to that same community and white families move in, they're no longer inner city families, right? So like that was something that was insightful to me when I was reading, and I thought, oh my goodness, I never thought about that before. And so how much of our language is so coded that we are not even aware of it, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's why it's kind of important to, like I keep saying, have like these messages get sent out in print. I'm sure journalists across the world use the words inner city and things like that and don't have any problems with it. But if there's no black editors to kind of stop and say, hey, we need to frame this a little bit differently, or like I said, have empathy for, whoever our subject it is that we're talking about, and try to get nuance about, what the situation is and why these people are in these situations because of systemic racism and the way we talk about crime and things like that. I mean, you can go on. And the thing about that is, people want to hire diversity reporters and let's talk about, race. And it's like, you need to have a black reporter talking about business, because there's racism in business, there's racism in education, there's racism in arts and entertainment, there's racism if we're talking about the economy, if we're talking about climate change. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's what so it's like, that needs to be kind of infused in the way we cover things across the board.
Yeah. Yeah.
Alexis, you talked about the support you got from your newsroom, but I'm curious whether you felt like the city had your back, or did you have people not treat you well because they saw what you were going through? What was that experience?
Literally, like? I was expecting to get like trolled, and none of that has happened. Like only after our executive editor, Keith Barris, he went on Fox News and did an interview with Laura Ingraham. So I got some kind of, that audience, they sent me a few rude tweets. But other than that, I was just completely taken aback because like you mentioned before, once everybody had copied and pasted my tweet and did the I stand with Alexis hashtag and ended up trending on Twitter that night. And it wasn't because of the 100 people in my newsroom that did it. People were just tweeting it. Like people from competing news outlets were tweeting it. People that just knew about what was happening that had nothing to do with media were just copying and pasting that tweet and hashtagging I stand with Alexis. And I was just completely taken aback. I've gotten letters sent to me from readers who, were saying, they were sorry for what happened to me and things like that. I mean, my DMs, my emails blew up. I mean, I was just completely taken aback by how much support I got from this city. I mean, it was insane. I never could have expected it. But like I keep saying, that just only reaffirmed that I was on the right side of history with this one. And, this really was kind of uncalled for the way I was treated. So I was so thankful for that. I mean, I was very grateful for that.
It's funny because in a city like Pittsburgh, like I wasn't born here, but I'm not really a sports fan. And I wouldn't know who Kenny Chesney was if I sent me a picture today. But I absolutely, as just a resident, have seen all the follow-up about the Kenny Chesney concert and what happens. So again, when I saw that picture, it was just so like, if you're in Pittsburgh, it was
such a Pittsburgh like tweet. Yeah.
Like there's even someone like me gets it.
Yeah. But even so, I mean, afterwards, people were saying, when the tweet had first went out, people were replying to me like, yeah, I mean, even if you think about the destruction after a Super Bowl or after a college football win or loss or St. Patrick's Day parade. I mean, we kind of see these instances where people wreck the city, but if it's in celebration, it's looked at one way, but if it's, for a cause that has to do with, supporting Black lives, it's looked at another way. So people were, I guess more so supporting that, agreeing with that double standard when it was framed that way.
Yes.
So yeah, I had a ton of support, and people thought that the punishment that I faced was too harsh and things like that. I mean, I was just really shocked by how many people spoke out for me. So I'm super grateful for that.
I'm curious to that feeling that you described about being in the newsroom and being one of the few Black reporters in the newsroom and feeling excluded or not heard. How often do you feel that when you're just in the city of Pittsburgh, when you're outside of the newsroom? Is that a common occurrence?
Oh, absolutely.
Really? Okay.
I mean, what's interesting is, like I said, I grew up here. So, growing up here, you kind of almost don't realize it. It's just like a thing, like I said, being the only Black person in my class for several years. I was in the honors program. I was in the gifted program. So that kind of put me in another, world where I was really the only one of two, maybe three Black people in the entire program, where I was taking these kind of AP classes and things like that. And then, like I said, I moved away. And when I moved to Philly to go to Temple, I mean, it's so diverse out there. Philadelphia is 4 times as big as Pittsburgh. Don't get me wrong. But, their population of Black and brown people, I'm sure is, I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but it's way more than what Pittsburgh has. And then when I moved back is when I realized, I was like, oh my God, like when me and my boyfriend moved back and we went to a restaurant, we were the only Black people to walk in, and we kind of got that first like, ooh, like I haven't felt this in a while, has Pittsburgh changed in the 3-4 years I've been gone, or has this always been how it was? And I just was so used to it. You know what I mean? Yeah. It was just so normal to me to be like that. But if we're talking about bars, restaurants, nightlife, there's always conversations about, the bars on East Carson Street, how they will use discrimination against you for your dress code and things like that. I mean, so it's not anything foreign to Pittsburgh. It's almost, kind of on brand that, there's a low percentage of Black people in any newsroom or corporation or office space. And that, we face the consequences of that, because of the segregation and like you spoke to a little bit earlier, even the equality as far as the neighborhoods and things like that. So I don't think it's, it was like what happened at the Post Gazette was kind of reflective, not to say everything was bad. Like I said, I got a lot of support from the city, but we've seen the comments and things about and how things were tense after Antoine Rose was killed. And that's a far different city than what we're seeing about all these people that are protesting now. It's very interesting to see how many people, people of non-color, white people, are protesting now and had kind of a different attitude towards the situation when Antoine Rose was killed 2 years ago. So, that's always in the back of my mind. I mean, I say, if you really want to know who Pittsburgh is, go scroll through some Facebook comments. You'll see just kind of the worst of it. I try to stay out of the comments, but I mean, Pittsburgh has a lot of work to do, and if it, I'm not sure what that looks like, but like I said, it's kind of in every aspect of the city for sure.
Hopefully the real city's somewhere in between, right? Between the Facebook comments and the hopefully it's somewhere in the middle. I don't know. What do you think, Barbara?
Yeah, it's interesting when you talked about like what it's like in the city. This past weekend, I went to one of the riverfront parks, and I was with my mom, and we were walking toward like benches that sit and look out at the water, and it was in Aspinwall. So as I was walking toward the water to the benches, they looked like they were empty, and then it looked like some people were sitting on them. And my initial thought was, oh my goodness, what if it's white people sitting at the benches? Are they going to be mad that black people are coming to sit at the benches? Like, I had this whole dialogue in my head about sitting at a bench where there's mostly white people in the neighborhood, right? So we got to the bench. They're like chairs. They're more like chairs. And there was a young African-American girl. So then my next thought was, oh my gosh, why is there an African-American girl in Aspinwall? So the racial piece of Pittsburgh is like embedded in you because you know what to expect in every zip code. Like, you definitely know what to expect. And so then later in the day, I walked along the path and there was a white couple who had a little dog, and the dog started like barking like crazy. And the thing that I appreciated, and this gets back to what you talked about, Alexis, about empathy, was that they both spoke to me. They spoke to me and they said they were sorry and that the dog is not dangerous and blah, blah, blah. And that in itself completely like lowered my racial expectation of everything being bad in that space, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that happens all the time for me.
Yeah, you kind of almost always have your guard up.
Yeah,
because you don't know what to expect. So I definitely understand.
The guard is up, and then someone says something, and it goes down, and then it goes up again, and so you're just like this walking, like, oh my gosh, is racism going to be part of my hour right now?
100%. Yeah.
I'm so sorry that happens to you. I mean, and it's as a white person, it's good to hear you talk about it, to hear those experiences, so that I, we can gain a better appreciation for what you're going through. I will say, and I don't want to say like everything's perfect in my neighborhood or in white neighborhoods, but I will say the other unusual outcome recently has been that there's so many houses that have Black Lives Matter rally signs in their front yards, and homemade signs that say, white silence equals violence, and just those things that I think white people, at least some white people, are trying to signal like, we're hearing you finally, and we do want to try to message to you that this shouldn't have to be a racial moment for you. It should just be a moment, and so I hopefully that takes some root and that moves forward and it has some real meaning behind it.
Did we talk about that, Andy?
Yeah, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but yeah, if you want to share your. Yeah.
So Alexis, Blackridge. The neighborhood of Blackridge. Mm-hmm. So I live in Penn Hills, but I'm like on the border of Wilkinsburg, East Hills, and Blackridge. So when I go for a walk, I usually walk toward Blackridge, and I walk in and out of the streets of Blackridge because there's not a lot of traffic, and I don't have to worry about traffic. So anyway, as I was walking through, I was telling Andy, like, when I saw so many Black Lives Matter signs, it gave me a sense of relief because I knew that I was walking through a predominantly white community, and I didn't want to always feel like, oh, there's that black girl again. Where does she live? But seeing all those signs on yards on different streets, again, pushed my guard down and gave me a level of comfort that, on every turn, there's at least one or two streets that have Black Lives Matter. And so I felt like it was okay for me to be there, and that, more than likely, nothing really racial would happen to me.
Right. Well, let me tell you, it's always okay for you to be there. no matter what. Like, it is okay for you to be there.
Yeah, but when like you overhear someone use the N-word and then you just have that feeling like, not that you shouldn't be there, but like I don't want to deal with this.
Wait,
right.
You just threw that. Does that happen to you? Like you overhear people use the N-word? Is that a thing?
Heck yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
It's interesting that you said, you just feel like I don't want to deal with this because, how often that we have to pick our battles is insane. And that kind of circles back to the tweet. It was like, am I going to fight this? You know what I mean? How am I going to pick this battle? And I've talked about it with my union president. I was like, hell yeah. Like let's take this as far as it can, because this is not right. But how many battles have I passed on? I mean, tons, thousands, millions. I mean, in my lifetime and newsrooms and this is my first news job. So, I mean, there's been a million battles that you kind of just like, I don't have the energy for this today. And that kind of goes back to what Andrew was saying at the beginning about like what white people's role in it is, and like how Black people have kind of had to carry the burden of fixing these problems that we didn't create. And, so it gets exhausting. It's like, do I have to correct this guy for saying the N-word? And then I have to go back and forth, like, should I, but meanwhile, his white friend is standing right next to him, or maybe even a Black friend is standing right next to him and probably allowing him to say whatever because he doesn't feel like fighting that battle. I mean, it's kind of just like this constant state of like, do I feel like dealing with this today? So I felt that one in my soul, seriously.
Well, and it's a great point you brought that up, because I think that is one thing that white people can do, in those conversations whenever, even if there's not a Black person within, hearing distance, and especially in those situations where it's just white people having a conversation, it's important for us to say that that's not acceptable, and that, you can't talk like that. And because, we talk about, conversations change. And if it's a group of just white people, sometimes people feel more comfortable saying things, and it needs to be in those situations where we say, no, that's still not acceptable.
It's almost more important behind closed doors. For sure.
I think that's important, Andy, right? Even when there's no people of color around, to hear that you have the allyship within you allows you to say something, because then what you're doing is you're setting the tone for this immediate circle of people. And, maybe they'll still be your friend after you say that, but then they also know that, maybe there's other people that feel like Andy, and I really like Andy, so I'm not going to say that anymore because I thought it was cool, but it's not, right? And so it starts to negate some of that conversation in other circles where you're not there.
What we're talking about really is like just kind of using your privilege for good. Yep. You know what I mean? Like white privilege has kind of been a hot button, but it's so real and it comes up in so many different situations. And like how far are you willing to take that privilege? How much of the power that you've been given as a white person in America are you willing to give up and kind of divvy out to people who haven't had those same opportunities and things like that? And how often are you willing to use your privilege for good? Because I feel like there's probably 100 times a day where it can be used, but you may not just know how or when, because it's just so inherent to kind of have these opportunities and have the privilege to even say N-word with no consequences. You know what I mean? It's a privilege and be in those kind of situations. So I think the more people that realize kind of the privilege and the power that you have in this society, and I think it's like a fluke or that Black people and brown people are just making things up, you know what I mean? I think the better, and that'll kind of guide you to the action part of it, and using it for good. You said something,
Alexis, about white people having to give up something to make room for Black people and people of color, and I just want, like in some cases it seems like it's not necessarily even having to give up, by making room for a Black colleague, or creating a path for a Black colleague to be successful, or a person of color to get ahead, doesn't have to diminish me as a white person. In many ways it can enhance what I'm doing. It can make the world, my world more interesting and brighter and more with a greater perspective. So that's something to think about too. Because for white people, like, well, we don't want to give up anything, but what are you really giving up? You're actually increasing something.
When you had a 400-year head start, it's like you can give up. You can give up a couple yards, I think.
Only 400 years, yeah.
Sometimes in my workshops, I say, I've had to, every day I wake up, I have 2 male sons, right? So every day, literally, I spend my days worrying about whether they're going to be, you know, in the face of a police officer for whatever reason. It doesn't even matter, right? And so I worry about that every day. And so in my trainings, I say, you know, I want you every day to think about what you can do as an ally to make a difference. So I think that, yeah, I totally agree with you, Alexis. Using your privilege for good is something that you can do. And it's not, you don't even realize how, like you said, Andy, how few things you could do a day that really make a huge impact without even giving up anything.
Well, a big part of it is having this conversation with both of you. So I want to thank you both again for, having the conversation. Alexis, for being here with us. Well, I think we could go on all day, but
definitely.
Yeah. But as our producer, Tyler Polk, said from the beginning before we came on the air, much respect to you and all the work that you've done. And, when you explained about taking on this challenge and what it would mean, it's good to hear you talk about it and and to share your perspective. So thanks for being here.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alexis. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I meant to say that even though we have the same last name, we're not related. Probably. This is like an inside thing.
Yeah, no, we're not.
But certainly I would be honored to be related to you.
Oh, thanks. We might be, honestly. You live right around the corner from me, so let's check into that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. You had some great words of wisdom, and we really appreciate it. And if there's any way that YWCA Greater Pittsburgh can connect with you or do anything with you beyond today, we'd love to, because our mission is eliminating racism and empowering women.
Nice.
And same for the Center for Media Innovation, too. Whatever we can do to support you. So.
I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Among Neighbors, a podcast on race, power, and privilege. The show is a joint project between the Point Park Center for Media Innovation and the YWCA of Greater Pittsburgh. And as always, the producer for this show is Tyler Polk.
Thank you for listening to Among Neighbors. This podcast was produced and recorded at the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University in downtown Pittsburgh. Audio versions of Among Neighbors is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, and Stitcher. Video version is available on YouTube.